There is a man sitting in a traffic jam, right now, who has not chosen a single thought he has had in the last 45 minutes. He woke up this morning and reached for his phone before his eyes had fully adjusted to the light. He scrolled for 11 minutes, not because he decided to, not because he planned it, not because it brought him any real satisfaction, but because his thumb simply moved. It moved the way it always moves. It moved because it has been moving that way for 2 years, trained by tiny pulses of stimulation to repeat the gesture before the brain even registers it as a choice. He saw a headline that irritated him, and the irritation sat in his chest for the next hour. He snapped at his wife over something small. He replayed the argument while brushing his teeth. He forgot his coffee on the counter. He drove onto the highway on the wrong side of his thoughts, and now he is sitting in this traffic jam, gripping the steering wheel, rehearsing a version of the morning that already happened, trying to win an argument that is already over, his heart rate slightly elevated, his jaw subtly clenched, his mind nowhere near where his body is. He believes he is a person who makes decisions, and in the most technical sense, he is right. He chose his route this morning. He chose the shirt he put on. He chose the music playing now. Or at least he tapped the same playlist he always taps when he gets in the car, so maybe chose is too generous a word. But the deeper truth, the one almost no one wants to examine, is that the vast majority of what he does, what he thinks, what he feels, and what he reacts to is not chosen at all. It runs on something closer to a program, a pattern, a series of grooves worn so deep into his nervous system that they fire automatically, below the threshold of conscious awareness, without his permission and often without his knowledge. He is not driving his life. He is being driven by it, and here is the part that makes this genuinely disturbing. He is not unusual. He is not broken. He is not a cautionary tale. He is, in nearly every meaningful way, the average modern human being, intelligent, well-meaning, reasonably self-aware, and almost completely unaware of the degree to which his inner life is being run by forces he has never once stopped to examine. Psychologists estimate that somewhere between 85 and 95% of human behavior is driven by unconscious habits, emotional reactions, and automatic mental patterns. 95%. Which means that for most people, most of the time, the self they believe is steering their life is actually sitting in the back seat, and something older, faster, and far less rational is behind the wheel. This is not a metaphor designed to frighten you. It is a description of how the human mind actually works, and once you understand it clearly, something remarkable becomes possible. Because here is what almost no one tells you about the mind's autopilot. It can be interrupted. It can be observed. And once observed, it can be gradually, deliberately, and permanently changed. That is what this audiobook is about. Not self-improvement in the shallow, productivity influencer sense. Not hacks or shortcuts or morning routines that promise to transform you in 30 days. This is something quieter and more fundamental. This is a conversation about the operating system running behind your thoughts. The invisible architecture of attention, emotion, habit, and reaction that determines what you see, what you feel, what you choose, and ultimately, who you become. It is about understanding that the mind is either your most powerful ally or your most persistent adversary, and the difference between those two outcomes is not intelligence or willpower or circumstances. The difference is awareness. The difference is the degree to which you have learned to watch your own mind, question your own patterns, and consciously choose which parts of yourself you want to strengthen. Because here is the truth that changes everything. You may not control every thought that enters your mind. Thoughts arise the way weather arises, suddenly, unbidden, shaped by forces so complex no human being could fully map them. But you can learn to control which thoughts you feed, which emotions you amplify, which habits you reinforce, which patterns you allow to continue operating beneath your awareness, and which ones you interrupt, examine, and consciously replace with something better. That skill, the skill of intentional mental direction, is the difference between a life that happens to you and a life you deliberately build. The man in the traffic jam is not lost. He is simply asleep. And the moment he wakes up, the moment any of us truly wake up to the degree our minds are running on automatic, the whole world looks different, more navigable, less like a river carrying you wherever it flows, and more like a landscape you can actually choose to move through. Let us begin. To understand how to take control of the mind, you first have to understand what you are actually dealing with. And the mind is far stranger, more layered, and more magnificent than most of us have ever been taught to appreciate. Most people think of their mind as a single thing, a unified self that thinks, feels, decides, and acts as one coherent unit. Neuroscience tells a very different story. The mind is not one thing. It is a collection of overlapping, sometimes competing systems, each operating at different speeds, serving different functions, shaped by different timelines of human evolution. And understanding even a few of these systems, even just getting a basic conceptual map of what is happening inside your head right now, will give you more leverage over your behavior than any motivational speech ever could. Let us start with the most fundamental division, the one between your fast brain and your slow brain. You have likely heard these described before, perhaps by the psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who spent decades studying them. The fast brain, what Kahneman called System 1, operates automatically, intuitively, and almost instantaneously. It is the system that reads the emotion on a face before you have consciously registered that you are even looking at a face. It is the system that makes you flinch at a loud noise, feel a surge of anxiety when you check your email, reach for a snack when you are bored, or feel inexplicably uncomfortable in a room where something is subtly off. System 1 is ancient. It was shaped over hundreds of thousands of years to keep your ancestors alive in a world where hesitation could mean death, where the ability to react faster than thought was a genuine survival advantage. It is extraordinarily fast, extraordinarily efficient, and almost entirely unconscious. Then there is the slow brain, System 2, the deliberate, effortful, analytical part of your mind that you probably think of as your real self. This is the part that does math, plans, reasons, debates, and makes conscious decisions. When you weigh the pros and cons of a choice, you are using System 2. When you construct an argument or follow a complex set of instructions, you are using System 2. The problem is that System 2 is slow. It is resource-intensive. It gets tired. And because it is resource-intensive, the brain, which is the most energy-hungry organ in the human body, is constantly looking for ways to offload decisions from System 2 back onto System 1, back onto the automatic, below the radar processing that takes almost no effort at all. This is the origin of habit. This is the origin of autopilot. The brain is not lazy in a moral sense. It is efficient in an evolutionary sense. Automating behavior is intelligent design. The problem arises when the behaviors that get automated are not the ones you would choose if you were fully awake. Layered on top of these two systems is your emotional brain. The limbic system, which is older than reason and faster than thought. The limbic system does not care about logic. It does not weigh consequences. It responds to perceived threats, rewards, and social signals with an immediacy that can make the prefrontal cortex, your thinking, planning, reasoning brain, feel almost irrelevant. When you feel a rush of anger after someone cuts you off in traffic, that is your limbic system. When you feel a surge of anxiety before a difficult conversation, that is your limbic system. When you feel the pull of social media, the craving for sugar, the desire to avoid discomfort at almost any cost, that is your limbic system in conversation with ancient reward circuits that were calibrated for a world that no longer exists. The limbic system is not your enemy. Emotions are not the enemy, but an unexamined emotional brain, one that has been allowed to drive behavior without ever being observed or questioned, becomes, over time, a kind of prison. And then there is the layer that most people never think about at all, the narrative self. The part of your mind that takes all the raw, chaotic, often contradictory material of your experience, your impulses, your feelings, your memories, your fears, and weaves them into a story. The story of who you are, the story of what you are capable of, the story of what you deserve and what you can expect from life. This narrative runs quietly in the background, influencing every decision you make, every risk you take or avoid, every relationship you enter or leave, every goal you pursue or abandon. And the most important thing to understand about this narrative is that most of us inherited it. We did not write it consciously. We absorbed it from our parents, our teachers, our early experiences, our culture, our failures, our wounds. And we have been living inside it ever since, as though it were simply reality rather than a story. These are the 4 layers you are working with: a fast automatic processor, a slow deliberate reasoner, an emotional system wired for ancient survival, and a narrative self running a story you may have never chosen. Together, these layers constitute what most people think of as simply themselves: their personality, their nature, their fixed and permanent way of being in the world. But none of it is fixed. None of it is permanent. Every single one of these layers is plastic, changeable, responsive to intentional effort over time. The brain is not a static organ. It is a living, adaptive tissue that reorganizes itself based on what you repeatedly do, think, and feel. This principle, called neuroplasticity, is perhaps the most important scientific finding in modern psychology, and it carries a message so radical that most people never fully take it in. You are not stuck with the mind you have. You can build a different one. Not by wishing, not by thinking positive thoughts, not by reading the right books, but by taking deliberate, consistent, sustained action in the direction of who you want to become. But before you can begin building, you need to understand why so many people lose control of their minds in the first place. Because the story of the modern mind is not simply the story of evolutionary wiring that hasn't caught up to the modern world. It is something more specific, more acute, and more intentional than that. The world you live in today has been engineered, in very precise ways, by very intelligent people, to capture your attention, trigger your emotional reactions, and pull you onto autopilot as often as possible. Understanding this is not paranoia. It is the beginning of a genuinely clear-eyed relationship with the environment you are living inside. Consider what attention actually is. Attention is not simply the act of noticing something. Attention is the most fundamental resource your mind possesses. Whatever you attend to consistently, whatever you repeatedly bring your focus toward, you strengthen, you amplify, you build. If you repeatedly attend to your worries, you develop a more anxious mind. If you repeatedly attend to what is wrong, you develop a more critical eye for imperfection. If you repeatedly attend to your goals, your values, and your aspirations, you gradually develop the kind of mind that is organized around them. Attention is the currency of mental development, and in the modern world, it is also the most valuable and contested resource on Earth. This is not an exaggeration. The most powerful technology companies in human history are competing for your attention. Not occasionally, not casually, but systematically, using teams of brilliant engineers, behavioral psychologists, and data scientists whose job is to understand the exact psychological mechanisms that make you keep scrolling, keep watching, keep clicking, keep coming back. They use variable reward schedules. The same psychological mechanism that makes slot machines so addictive, to create unpredictable patterns of stimulation that keep the brain's dopamine system in a constant state of anticipation. They use social validation signals, likes, comments, shares, to trigger the same neural circuits that evolved to monitor your social standing in a small community where your survival depended on belonging. They use outrage, conflict, and novelty because the brain's threat detection system responds to these signals faster and more powerfully than it responds to anything calm, nuanced, or genuinely true. The entire architecture of modern media, social and otherwise, is built on a deep and ruthless understanding of human psychological vulnerability, and it works. The average person today spends somewhere between 6 and 7 hours every day staring at screens. For young people, the numbers are often higher. This does not mean technology is inherently evil or that you should live off the grid. It means that the default settings of the modern world are not neutral. They are not designed with your mental health, your cognitive clarity, or your long-term flourishing in mind. They are designed to extract your attention and convert it into advertising revenue. And if you are living on the default settings, if you are moving through your day without ever questioning the patterns of your own attention, then you are living in a world that is constantly winning that competition, and you are the resource being spent. But technology is only one dimension of the problem. The deeper issue is the emotional reactivity that modern life triggers, and that so few of us have ever been taught to work with. Emotional reactivity is the tendency to respond to events immediately, automatically, and without reflection. Something happens, a critical comment, an unexpected setback, a perceived slight, a piece of threatening news. And before you have had time to think, you have already reacted. You have said something you will regret. You have made a decision you didn't mean to make. You have sent an email you will wish you could recall. You have eaten the thing, bought the thing, said the thing, done the thing, and only afterward, in the quiet that follows, does your thinking brain catch up and say, wait, was that actually the response I wanted to give? Emotional reactivity is not a character flaw. It is a natural outcome of living in a system that is constantly triggering your nervous system's alarm responses. Cortisol, the stress hormone, rises not just in response to physical danger, as it evolved to do, but in response to every perceived social threat, every piece of negative news, every moment of comparison with other people's curated lives, every unread notification, every uncertain outcome. When cortisol is chronically elevated, your thinking brain goes offline. Your capacity for patience, nuance, creativity, and long-term reasoning is physiologically impaired. You become faster to react and slower to reflect. You make worse decisions. You treat the people around you with less generosity. You become, in the most literal neurological sense, less of yourself. And underneath all of this runs the deeper machinery of habit and cognitive bias, the invisible architecture of the mind's shortcuts. Habits are the brain's way of conserving energy. When a behavior is repeated often enough in the same context, the brain automates it, building a neural pathway so well worn that the behavior eventually fires without any conscious initiation at all. This is enormously useful when the habits being automated are ones you would choose. Exercise, healthy eating, deliberate practice, meaningful work. When these are habitual, they no longer require willpower, which means they happen reliably even when you are tired, stressed, or distracted. But the same mechanism operates with equal power for habits you would never consciously choose. Reaching for your phone when you feel anxious, eating when you feel empty, procrastinating when you feel overwhelmed, withdrawing when you feel misunderstood. These patterns, repeated hundreds or thousands of times, become automatic. And because they are automatic, most people never stop to realize they are happening at all. They mistake their habits for their nature. Cognitive biases add another layer of complexity. These are systematic errors in thinking, patterns of distorted reasoning that the brain uses because they are fast and usually close enough to accurate, that they worked well enough during most of human evolutionary history. Confirmation bias leads you to selectively notice and remember information that confirms what you already believe, while automatically discounting evidence that challenges it. The negativity bias leads you to weight negative experiences more heavily than positive ones. An ancient survival mechanism that helped your ancestors learn quickly from danger, but that in the modern world means you will replay a single critical comment far more often and far more intensely than you revisit an equally meaningful compliment. The availability heuristic leads you to overestimate the likelihood of things that come easily to mind, which is why watching the news makes the world feel more dangerous than it statistically is. These biases are not stupidity. They are efficient shortcuts, but in a complex modern world, they regularly lead intelligent people to wildly distorted conclusions about themselves, other people, and the world they are living in. All of this is operating constantly, mostly below the surface of awareness, mostly without your consent. You inherited a brain built for a world that no longer exists. You live in a culture that is actively competing for your attention. You carry thought patterns, emotional habits, and behavioral grooves that formed long before you were old enough to evaluate them. And you have been moving through all of it largely on autopilot, reacting rather than responding, being shaped rather than choosing your own shape. This is the situation, not a comfortable one, but an honest one. And honesty, it turns out, is where real change begins. Meet Daniel. Daniel is 34 years old. He works in project management for a mid-sized logistics company, a job that is neither exciting nor terrible, the kind of job that pays the bills and takes up most of the waking hours of his life without ever quite becoming something he would describe as meaningful. He is not unhappy in any dramatic way. There is no crisis in his life, no catastrophe on the horizon. There is simply this low, persistent feeling, like a frequency playing just below the threshold of conscious awareness, that something is slightly off, that he is somehow living adjacent to his life rather than inside it, that the days are going somewhere, but he is not entirely sure where. Daniel wakes at 7, hits snooze twice, and by 7:15 is already on his phone. He is not doing anything specific. He is doing everything and nothing. Scrolling through news, checking Instagram, reading headlines that will not matter to him in an hour, watching a 15-second video that makes him laugh briefly before he is already on the next one. He lies there for 22 minutes. He has never counted, but if he did, he would be alarmed. Before finally getting up, by the time he is in the shower, his mind is already busy. He is replaying a conversation from yesterday's meeting where his manager, Tom, made a comment that Daniel cannot quite categorize. Was it a compliment, a subtle criticism, a power move? He turns it over and over in his mind, under the running water, his jaw tight, constructing responses he will never deliver, arguing his case to an audience that exists only in his head. Breakfast is whatever is quick. He has not meal planned since a phase 2 years ago that lasted exactly 11 days. He eats standing up, still on his phone, catching the tail end of a podcast he started 3 weeks ago and has never quite found the momentum to finish. He takes the same route to work he has always taken, listens to the same kind of content he always listens to, buys the same coffee from the same place, and arrives at his desk with the particular feeling of a man who has already spent considerable energy without having yet done anything. The workday unfolds in the usual rhythm. He checks email obsessively, not because he is deeply invested in his inbox, but because the act of checking has become a nervous tic, a way of managing the low-grade anxiety that sits beneath everything like groundwater. He attends meetings where he sometimes contributes and sometimes watches himself drift, his mind pulling toward dinner plans or a comment someone made on social media, or the nagging sense that he should be doing something more with his life. He does not know precisely what that something is. He thinks about it vaguely, the way people think about a country they have heard is beautiful, but have never taken the steps to actually visit. After work, he goes to the gym approximately 1.5 times per week on average. Sometimes 3 times, sometimes none, depending on variables he cannot quite predict and has never quite analyzed. He has a gym goal that has not meaningfully changed in several years. He knows what he would need to do to reach it. He does not do it consistently. He is not sure why. He tells himself it is time, and then he finds himself watching television until 11. Not because he loves what he is watching, but because the act of watching requires nothing of him, and by 8 o'clock his brain is so overstimulated from a day of fragmented attention that anything requiring genuine effort feels impossible. He is not lazy. This is the part that is hardest for Daniel to reconcile. He is not stupid or weak-willed or lacking in values. He cares deeply about his life, about the kind of person he wants to be, about the future he wants to build. But the caring and the doing exist in different compartments, and something between intention and action keeps getting lost. He makes the same resolutions. He has the same conversations with himself. He reads books that briefly rearrange his inner furniture and then sit on the shelf. He subscribes to newsletters about productivity and then does not read them. He starts habits and abandons them. He plans and postpones and plans again. And underneath all of it, the low frequency hums on. The sense that the Daniel who exists moment to moment, reacting to his phone, drifting through his workday, collapsing into his evenings, is somehow not quite the Daniel he intended to be. On a Thursday in October, Daniel has a conversation that unsettles him in a way he cannot easily dismiss. He is having lunch with his friend Marcus, who is one of those people Daniel has always admired with a mixture of genuine warmth and faint discomfort. The kind of admiration that contains, if you look at it honestly, a question about yourself. Marcus seems to inhabit his life differently. He is not dramatically more successful, not dramatically wealthier, not dramatically luckier, but he seems present in a way Daniel does not quite feel present. He asks better questions. He listens more fully. He seems to have made peace with some of the things Daniel is still at war with. They are talking about goals, and Marcus says something that lodges in Daniel like a splinter. He says, "I used to think I needed more motivation. Turns out what I needed was to actually pay attention to what I was doing all day. Like, really see it. Because I was convinced I was trying, but I was also on autopilot 90% of the time and had no idea." Daniel nods and changes the subject. But on the drive home, the splinter works deeper. Because he knows Marcus is not talking about him, but Daniel cannot stop feeling that he is. He is convinced he is trying. He begins to suspect, on autopilot 90% of the time, and he has, until this moment, had no idea. The discomfort of that recognition is real, but it is also, though Daniel does not yet know it, the beginning of something important, because the most significant thing that had happened to Daniel in a very long time was not an external event. It was a shift in attention, a turning of the gaze inward, a moment small and unremarkable on the surface, in which he stopped watching the content of his mind and started watching the process, started noticing the noticing, and in that tiny, almost invisible shift, a door opened. What Daniel experienced in that car on that Thursday, that slight, uncomfortable clarity about his own automatic patterns, is what every serious tradition of human self-development, from ancient Stoicism to modern cognitive, behavioral therapy, from Zen Buddhism to contemporary neuroscience, has pointed to as the foundational skill. Not motivation, not discipline, not the right morning routine. Awareness. The capacity to observe your own mind in motion. To step back from the automatic stream of thought, emotion, and reaction and simply see it. Clearly, honestly, without judgment and without attachment. This is not mystical. It is not religious. It is not a special gift available only to monks or philosophers. It is a capacity that every human being possesses, though most have never been shown how to access it or cultivate it. Psychologists call it metacognition, thinking about thinking. Mindfulness teachers call it observing mind or witness consciousness. Stoic philosophers called it the ruling faculty, the part of a person that can choose how to respond to what arises in the mind rather than simply being carried by it. Whatever you call it, the experience of it is the same, a felt sense of gap, a space, a pause between stimulus and response in which something other than automatic reaction becomes possible. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who developed what became known as logotherapy, wrote perhaps the most often quoted sentence in the psychological literature on human freedom. He wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. and in our response lies our growth and our freedom. Frankl wrote this from the perspective of a man who had experienced conditions of suffering so extreme that virtually every external freedom had been stripped away. And what he found in those conditions was that the one freedom no external force could reach was the freedom of the inner attitude, the choice of how to respond to what arises inside. That freedom begins with awareness. It begins with the ability to observe the space between stimulus and response, and to consciously inhabit it rather than letting the automatic response fire unexamined. In practical terms, awareness functions like a light switched on in a room that has been dark. The moment you begin to observe your thoughts and reactions, rather than simply identifying with them, the moment you shift from "I am angry" to "I am noticing a feeling of anger," or from "I cannot do this" to "I am noticing thoughts of self-doubt," something subtle but profound happens. The intensity of the experience decreases, not because the emotion is suppressed or the thought is denied, but because the act of observation creates distance. It introduces a perspective from which the thought or feeling is no longer all of reality, but rather a passing event in the field of a larger awareness. And from that larger perspective, choices become visible that were completely invisible before. Neuroscience has a term for this process: affect labeling. Research conducted at UCLA by Matthew Lieberman and colleagues demonstrated that simply naming an emotional state, putting it into words, reduces activity in the amygdala, the brain's primary alarm center, and increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought, planning, and emotional regulation. In other words, the ancient wisdom of stepping back and naming what you feel is not merely philosophical advice. It is a physiological intervention. Naming the emotion actually changes what happens in the brain. It shifts the processing from the fast, reactive, emotional system toward the slower, more deliberate, more rational one. It creates, in neurological terms, precisely the space that Frankl wrote about, the space in which you get to choose. But awareness, like any skill, has to be practiced deliberately and consistently to develop. And the primary practice that every major tradition and most modern research points toward as the most effective way to train this awareness is some form of meditation. Or more precisely, some form of directed attention practice. The word meditation carries a lot of cultural freight. Images of monks sitting cross-legged, of incense and silence, of spiritual endeavor that feels remote from the practical demands of modern life. Forget all of that. Strip it down to its functional core, and what you are left with is this: a practice of repeatedly noticing where your attention has gone and gently returning it to where you intended it to be. That is it. That is the whole practice. And it is one of the most powerful training methods for the brain that has ever been systematically studied. When you sit quietly and attempt to hold your attention on your breath for 10 minutes, you are not trying to achieve a state of mental blankness. You are engaging in a form of mental weight training. Every time your mind wanders to a worry, a memory, a plan, a random thought, and you notice that it has wandered, and return your attention to the breath, you are performing one repetition of the fundamental skill of metacognitive awareness. You are practicing the noticing. You are practicing the returning. Over time, with repetition, this practice changes the brain in measurable ways. It strengthens the prefrontal cortex. It reduces baseline amygdala reactivity. It thickens the insula, the part of the brain involved in interoception, the ability to sense your own internal states. It increases gray matter density in regions associated with attention, emotional regulation, and self-awareness. In short, it builds the neurological infrastructure of intentional living, and the benefits extend far beyond the cushion or the quiet room. People who practice sustained attention training, even at relatively modest levels of 10 to 20 minutes a day, consistently report improvements in their ability to notice when their mind has wandered during conversation, during work, during conflict. They catch their emotional reactions earlier, before they have fully taken over. They make better decisions under pressure. They sleep better, speak more carefully, and experience less chronic anxiety. Not because their lives have changed, but because their relationship to their own inner experience has changed. They have developed, through practice, the capacity to be with what arises without being consumed by it. This is the first and most foundational layer of taking back control of your mind, not controlling your thoughts, but observing them, not suppressing your emotions, but seeing them clearly enough to choose how you respond to them. Not fighting autopilot with willpower, but developing the awareness to recognize when autopilot has engaged. And in that recognition, finding the leverage point from which a different choice becomes possible. Now, awareness alone is not enough. Observing your mind gives you the perspective to make different choices. But making those choices consistently, especially in the face of distraction, discomfort, and the relentless pull of well-worn habit, requires the deliberate training of another capacity, attention. And attention, in the modern world, is under siege in ways that have no precedent in human history. The ability to concentrate, to hold your mind steadily on a single thing without being pulled away by distraction, is not just one cognitive skill among many. It is the cognitive skill. Everything else in your mental life depends on it. You cannot deeply understand something without sustained attention. You cannot solve complex problems without sustained attention. You cannot have a genuinely meaningful conversation without sustained attention. You cannot experience real satisfaction in your work without sustained attention. You cannot feel truly present in a relationship without sustained attention. The quality of your attention is the quality of your life, not in some vague philosophical sense, but in the very direct sense that every experience is mediated by the attention you bring to it, and the modern world has declared open war on your capacity for sustained attention. This is not hyperbole. Research by the Microsoft Corporation in 2015, drawing on surveys and electroencephalography data, found that the average human attention span had decreased from 12 seconds in 2000 to approximately 8 seconds by 2013. There is ongoing debate about the precise methodology of that study, but the broader trend it reflects is not seriously contested. Attention spans are shrinking, and the saturation of our lives with notification-based media, rapid fire content, and constant low-grade stimulation appears to be a significant driver. The average person now checks their phone somewhere between 80 and 150 times per day. The average piece of digital content is consumed for less than 8 seconds. The average office worker checks their email every 6 minutes. We are living in an attention economy, a system in which the fundamental currency being traded is the ability to hold your mind in one place. And most of us are going bankrupt without noticing. But here is what is crucial to understand: attention is not a fixed attribute. It is a trainable skill. The research on this is clear and compelling. Studies of experienced meditators show radically different patterns of brain activity during sustained attention tasks compared to untrained subjects. Differences that reflect genuine structural changes in the brain's attentional circuitry, not just differences in effort or motivation. The brain regions most involved in attention, the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, show measurable growth in people who practice sustained attention training over time. Attention is a muscle, and like any muscle, it responds to deliberate, progressive training with increased strength and capacity. Training attention begins with a single, deceptively simple commitment, deciding what you will pay attention to, and then actually paying attention to it. This sounds obvious. It is actually one of the most radical acts available to a modern human being, because the default mode of modern life is to let the environment determine your attention, to follow whatever notification appears, whatever stimulus fires, whatever emotional pull arises, without ever pausing to ask, is this where I choose to direct my mind right now? Making that choice, actively, consciously, as a deliberate act of self-direction, is where the training begins. One of the most effective and underappreciated strategies for protecting attention is what researchers call environmental design, structuring your physical and digital environment to make sustained attention easier and distraction harder. This is based on a fundamental insight about human behavior. Most of the time, people do not do what they intend to do because they make a different, more deliberate choice. They do what is easiest. They follow the path of least resistance. And in a world where your phone is within reach, where every app is engineered to pull you back, where notifications arrive at random intervals, like the unpredictable rewards of a slot machine, the path of least resistance leads directly away from sustained focus. Changing the path, removing the phone from the room, turning off notifications, using website blockers during focused work periods, designing a physical workspace that signals to your brain that this is a place for concentrated effort, is not a workaround. It is the primary intervention. It is working with your actual psychology rather than against it. Beyond environmental design, developing the ability to work in focused intervals, what the writer Cal Newport calls deep work, is perhaps the single most powerful cognitive practice available to a knowledge worker today. Deep work is defined as the ability to focus without distraction on a cognitively demanding task. It is the opposite of the fragmented, multitasking, notification, saturated mode that most people operate in most of the time. Research on expert performance suggests that the ability to do deep work is both increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. Rare, because the environment makes it so difficult. Valuable, because it is the primary driver of the kind of complex thinking that actually moves projects, ideas, and careers forward. The practice of deep work is not complicated. You decide on a task. You set aside a specific block of time, initially perhaps 60 minutes, eventually 2 or 3 or 4 hours. You remove everything that could interrupt you. You work on the task with your full, undivided attention, and when your mind wanders, because it will, you notice it and return. Every session of deep work is also a session of attention training. You are simultaneously accomplishing meaningful work and building the mental capacity to accomplish more of it in the future. But attention training, like awareness practice, requires something that feels increasingly countercultural in modern life: the willingness to be bored. When you remove stimulation from your environment, when you sit with your thoughts, rather than reaching for your phone. When you allow yourself to experience the discomfort of an unengaged mind without immediately filling the void, you are doing something neurologically important. You are giving your brain the space to consolidate learning, process experience, generate novel connections, and rest its overworked attentional circuits. The default mode network, the brain's resting state, is actually highly active during periods of apparent inactivity, involved in memory consolidation, future simulation, creative insight, and the construction of a coherent sense of self. When you never allow your mind to rest, when every moment of potential boredom is immediately filled with stimulation, you deprive yourself of the cognitive processes that boredom makes possible. Learning to be bored, to tolerate the discomfort of an unoccupied mind without reaching for relief, is one of the most important and most undervalued skills of the modern age. Alongside attention sits the domain of emotional mastery, perhaps the most misunderstood area of human psychology when it comes to self-development. The cultural messages about emotions that most of us have received are remarkably unhelpful. On one side, there is the suppression narrative. Real strength means not letting your feelings show, pushing through regardless of how you feel, keeping your emotional life under tight control. On the other side, there is the expression narrative. All feelings must be felt fully and expressed immediately. Any restraint is unhealthy repression. Following your emotions is the same as living authentically. Both of these narratives, taken to their extremes, produce the same outcome. People who are governed by their emotions, rather than equipped to work with them skillfully. The scientific reality is more nuanced and ultimately more empowering than either extreme. Emotions are not enemies to be conquered. They are not obstacles standing between you and good decision-making. They are data. They are the mind's fastest and most integrated form of evaluation. A synthesis of perception, memory, bodily sensation, and implicit learning that arrives in the form of feeling, before the thinking brain has had time to form a verdict. Fear tells you that something in your environment resembles past danger. Anger tells you that a boundary has been crossed or a value has been violated. Sadness tells you that something important has been lost. Guilt tells you that your behavior has fallen short of your own standards. These messages are not always accurate. They can be triggered by misperceptions, old wounds, cognitive biases, and cultural conditioning. But they are always worth listening to, even when, especially when, you ultimately decide not to act on them. The key insight of emotional intelligence is not that you should feel your emotions less, but that you should relate to them differently. The difference between someone who is controlled by their emotions and someone who works with their emotions skillfully is not the intensity of what they feel. It is what they do with what they feel. It is the relationship between the feeling and the response. And that relationship can be changed, trained, and developed over time, in the same way that any other mental skill can be developed. The process begins, again, with awareness. The ability to recognize an emotional state early, to catch the first signals of rising anxiety, anger, or despair before they have fully taken over your cognitive system, gives you the leverage to respond rather than simply react. This is called emotional granularity by psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett, the ability to distinguish between emotions with precision and nuance rather than experiencing them as an undifferentiated wash of feeling. Research shows that people with high emotional granularity, who can identify not just that they feel bad, but specifically whether they feel anxious, disappointed, embarrassed, or resentful, show lower levels of emotional reactivity, greater capacity for emotional regulation, and better psychological outcomes overall. The ability to name the emotion, to identify it clearly, is itself a form of mastery. The second layer of emotional skill is what psychologists call cognitive reappraisal, the ability to actively change the meaning you assign to an emotional trigger. When you encounter a situation that produces a strong emotional response, the emotion you feel is not produced by the situation itself, but by your interpretation of it. The same event, criticism from a manager, conflict with a partner, rejection from a potential employer, can be interpreted in ways that produce despair, anger, or shame, or in ways that produce curiosity, motivation, or resolve. This is not denial. It is not toxic positivity. It is the recognition that the brain's process of making is active and constructed, not a passive reception of objective reality, and that you have genuine influence over that process. Studies on cognitive reappraisal consistently show that people who practice this skill, who deliberately look for alternative interpretations of challenging situations, rather than accepting the first, most emotionally intense interpretation, experience lower levels of negative emotion over time, without suppressing or denying what they feel. They are not feeling less. They are seeing more. They are expanding their interpretive repertoire so that the mind's first draft of a situation is not automatically the final version. The third layer of emotional skill is what might be called distress tolerance, the ability to be with difficult feelings without immediately trying to escape them. This is perhaps the most important and most neglected dimension of emotional intelligence, because the primary way that people avoid uncomfortable emotions is not by thinking differently. It is by distraction, by checking the phone, by eating, by staying busy, by keeping the television on so the house is never quiet enough for the hard feelings to surface. The avoidance provides temporary relief and long-term escalation, because emotions that are not processed tend not to dissolve. They tend to accumulate, finding expression in ways that are often more disruptive and less controllable than the original feeling would have been. Learning to sit with discomfort, to allow difficult emotions to exist in your experience without either acting them out or pushing them away, is a skill that has to be practiced deliberately. It is uncomfortable by definition, but the capacity to tolerate discomfort without being destroyed by it is, at a fundamental level, what emotional resilience actually is. It is not the absence of pain. It is the ability to experience pain, to acknowledge it fully, and to continue moving in the direction of your values anyway. That is not suppression. That is strength. Stoic philosophers practiced something they called voluntary discomfort, deliberately exposing themselves to mild forms of hardship, cold, hunger, fatigue, not as punishment, but as a way of training the relationship between stimulus and response. The logic was elegant. If you have never experienced being cold without immediately seeking warmth, then cold has power over you. The moment it arrives, your comfort demands that you do whatever it takes to make it stop. But if you have voluntarily sat with cold before, if you have felt it and allowed it to exist without immediately acting on it, then cold becomes something you can acknowledge without being commanded by it. Modern research on what is called psychological flexibility developed within acceptance and commitment therapy, reflects the same logic. The goal is not to feel better. The goal is to get better at feeling, to develop the capacity to be with whatever arises without losing your sense of direction. None of this happens without something deeper than technique. Techniques are tools. Tools require a hand to hold them, and that hand is shaped by habit, by the repeated patterns of action and thought that, over time, have constituted the person who holds the tool. To truly change how you think, how you feel, and how you respond, to move from living on autopilot to living with genuine intention, you have to eventually engage with the level of identity, with the story you tell about who you are and what you are capable of. The science of habit formation has been widely popularized in recent years, largely through the work of researchers like Charles Duhigg and B.J. Fogg, as well as writers like James Clear. The basic architecture of a habit is now reasonably well understood: a cue that triggers a routine that produces a reward, a loop that the brain, once established, will seek to repeat. This framework is genuinely useful. But what is perhaps less widely understood, and more fundamentally important, is the relationship between habits and identity. Because habits are not just behaviors. They are votes for a particular kind of self. Every time you act in a way that is consistent with the person you want to become, you are casting a small vote for that identity. And every time you act inconsistently with it, you are casting a vote against it. The identity emerges from the accumulation of those votes over time. This means that the question of sustainable habit change is not, at its core, a question of strategy. It is a question of self-conception. The person who is trying to start exercising because they think they should is fighting a very different internal battle than the person who has genuinely internalized the identity of someone who moves their body regularly. For the first person, every workout is an act of willpower against a resistant self. For the second person, every workout is an expression of who they already are. The goal, then, is not just to build new habits. It is to build the new identity that makes those habits feel natural. This does not happen through affirmations. It does not happen through believing things about yourself that the evidence does not yet support. It happens through action, small, consistent, repeated actions that gradually accumulate into evidence. Evidence that you are the kind of person who follows through, the kind of person who does what they say, the kind of person who shows up, even imperfectly, even inadequately, even on the days when it feels pointless. Each of those actions is a brick, and brick by brick, over time, a different self takes shape, not the self you declared yourself to be, the self you demonstrated yourself to be. The reprogramming of thought patterns works through a similar mechanism. The thoughts that feel most true, most automatic, most inevitable, the thoughts about your limitations, your worth, your potential, your safety, are not facts about reality. They are the residue of repetition. They are thoughts that have been thought so many times that the neural pathways carrying them are smooth and deep, while the pathways for alternative thoughts are thin and rarely used. Cognitive behavioral therapy is, at its core, a systematic approach to exactly this challenge, identifying automatic thought patterns, evaluating their accuracy, and deliberately rehearsing alternative interpretations until they begin to feel as natural and automatic as the ones they replaced. The brain does not distinguish between what is real and what is vividly imagined at the level of neural firing. Athletes use this. When a sprinter visualizes their race with sufficient detail and emotional engagement, the neurons that would fire during the actual race fire during the visualization as well. The same principle applies to mental habits. When you deliberately and repeatedly rehearse a calmer response to a familiar trigger, a more generous interpretation of a difficult situation, a more confident internal monologue before a challenging moment, you are literally building the neural infrastructure for those responses. You are not pretending. You are practicing. And practice, at the level of the brain, is construction. This brings us to what might be the most essential question of all. Not what habits you want to build or what thoughts you want to change, but what kind of mind you want to become the architect of, because the deepest work of self-mastery is not about eliminating weakness. It is about building something, a coherent, deliberate, integrated way of engaging with life that reflects your values rather than your fears, your intentions rather than your impulses, your best self rather than your most automatic one. The concept of personal standards is perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of sustained self-development. A standard is not a goal. A goal is a destination. A standard is the floor you decide never to fall below. A line you draw in your own interior landscape and commit to defending, not perfectly, not without struggle, but with genuine seriousness. The people who consistently live at the highest levels of personal effectiveness, who are known for their reliability, their integrity, their ability to perform under pressure, are not, by and large, people of extraordinary talent or perfect discipline. They are people who have set standards for themselves and have decided that those standards are non-negotiable. They are people who have built, through years of deliberate practice, a relationship with their own commitments in which breaking those commitments is genuinely uncomfortable. Not because the world will punish them, but because they have internalized the expectation and made it part of who they are. This is what self-discipline actually is at its most functional. Not the brute force suppression of desire, not white-knuckled willpower deployed against the rebel forces of your own impulses. Self-discipline, properly understood, is the alignment between what you say matters to you and how you spend your time, your attention, and your energy. It is the reduction of the gap between intention and action. And it is built not through extraordinary acts of heroic effort, but through the unglamorous, repeated practice of doing what you said you would do, especially when you do not feel like it, especially when no one is watching, especially when the easier path is right there and calling your name. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor and Stoic philosopher, kept a private journal, the work we know today as the Meditations, in which he returned, over and over, to a single theme: the question of whether his actions on any given day reflected his own best conception of who he was. Not the world's standard, not the standard of public reputation, his own. He was the most powerful person in the Roman world, and he spent his private moments holding himself accountable to a private standard of character that the world might never see. What he was building, through those repeated acts of self-examination and renewed commitment, was something the Stoics called the ruling faculty, the capacity to govern the inner life with as much intentionality and care as the most important external responsibilities. That governing capacity is not given, it is built. Day by day, choice by choice, in the small, unwitnessed moments when no one is watching and the easier path is available, and you choose the harder one anyway. Intentional thinking. the practice of deliberately shaping the content and quality of your inner life, is not something most people were ever taught. We are taught how to think about the world. We are rarely taught how to think about our thinking. The result is that most people's inner lives are something that happens to them. A stream of automatic associations, habitual narratives, reactive emotions, and unconscious assumptions that feels like reality, but is, in truth, a very edited, very particular, very contingent construction. Learning to think intentionally means learning to choose your inputs, the information, media, and conversations you allow into your mind, with the same care and deliberateness that a serious athlete brings to their nutrition. It means learning to question your automatic interpretations, especially the ones about yourself. It means learning to ask, when a familiar narrative arises, when you hear the voice that says you're not good enough, or this is too hard, or people like me don't get to do things like this, to ask, is this true? How do I know it is true? What would be possible if it were not true? These are not rhetorical questions. They are genuinely investigative ones, and the practice of asking them, consistently, patiently, without demanding immediate answers, gradually erodes the authority of thought patterns that have never been examined. It introduces flexibility into places that have been rigid. It creates options where only one path seemed visible before. Now, return to Daniel, 6 months after the conversation with Marcus in that lunch place, and he is sitting in the same traffic jam on the same Thursday morning commute. But something about the inside of the car feels different. Or rather, something about the inside of the driver feels different. He still hit snooze once this morning. He is still human. But he woke up at 7:12 and, for the first time in what feels like years, chose not to reach for his phone. He lay there for a moment, 5 minutes, maybe, just breathing. He had read about it, and then finally tried it, and in those 5 minutes, something that he cannot quite name but could feel as clearly as sunlight happened in his chest. A quiet. Not peace exactly, because the mind was still moving, still producing its usual stream of associations and plans and half-formed thoughts. But a quality of presence underneath the movement. A sense of being behind the thoughts, rather than inside them. He still sometimes replays conversations in the shower, but now he notices when he is doing it. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, he sets it down. He says to himself, quietly, I'm doing the replay thing. I'm going to come back to now. And he does. Not perfectly, but he does. He started meditating 9 weeks ago. Not for long, 12 minutes in the morning, using an app. He does not love it. He does not always feel the benefits during the session itself, but he has begun to notice something that he finds genuinely surprising. He catches himself faster. When the irritation rises, when his manager says something that triggers the old defensiveness, when the traffic backs up and the jaw begins to tighten, there is a moment, small and not always reliable, in which he sees it before it has fully taken over. A moment in which he knows that he is getting hooked and has, for just long enough, the choice not to be. He does not always take the choice, but he has it more than he used to. He has made 2 other changes that would seem small to anyone watching from the outside, but feel, from the inside, like restructuring the foundation of a building. He moved his phone charger from his nightstand to the other side of the room. This is not a dramatic act, but it means that in the morning, the phone is not the first thing he reaches for, and at night, it is not the last screen glowing in his face. and in the space that opened in the mornings. Those 5 or 10 minutes when the phone is across the room and the mind is still quiet. He has begun to do something he had forgotten he was capable of. He thinks, deliberately, without agenda, without input from anyone else's content or opinion. He thinks about what matters to him, what kind of person he is becoming, what he actually wants from the day that is beginning, rather than simply falling into whatever the day brings. The second change is simpler and stranger. He started saying no to the things he was doing only because he had always done them. The Tuesday evening social commitment that left him feeling hollowed out. The weekend habit of spending 3 hours in a semi-conscious scroll through content that he consumed without ever quite choosing. He said no to them, not because they were wrong, but because they were automatic, and the things that are automatic are the things most worth examining. He replaced them, not with anything heroic or impressive, but with things that feel more like him. A longer run on Sunday morning, a book he actually finishes, a conversation with his sister that goes deep enough to matter. He is not transformed. He would resist the word. He is the same Daniel, the same confusions, the same occasional laziness, the same tendency to spiral when he is stressed, but the spiral now has a ceiling. There is a part of him that watches the spiral and says, "I see you." And that part, however thin it still sometimes feels, holds. It holds when the old impulses rise. It holds in the traffic jam on the Thursday morning. It holds in the moment between the stimulus and the response. That infinitely small and infinitely important space. When the old Daniel would have simply reacted, and the new Daniel pauses, just barely, just long enough, and chooses. What Daniel found, and what every person who has ever genuinely taken back their inner life has found, is that the changes that mattered most were not the dramatic ones. They were not the moments of peak motivation or sudden insight or radical transformation. They were the small, repeated, almost invisible choices, the choice to watch rather than react, to pause rather than spiral, to return rather than stay lost, the choice to be, in each small and unglamorous moment, a little more intentional than the moment before. These choices, accumulated over weeks and months and years, become the person. They become, eventually, the mind. And so we come to the close of this conversation, not an ending so much as a point of departure, because everything spoken here has been preparation, orientation, a map, and a map, as you know, is not the territory. The territory is your life. The territory is the actual, lived experience of sitting with your thoughts in the morning, rather than reaching for the phone. The territory is the pause before the reactive email goes out, the space between the insult and the response, the moment in the afternoon when the familiar boredom arrives, and you choose to notice it rather than escape it. The territory is the repeated, daily, sometimes tedious, sometimes quietly exhilarating practice of paying attention to your own mind. Your mind is your greatest asset. This is not a platitude. It is the most literal description of the most important resource you will ever possess. Every achievement in your life, every relationship, every creation, every solved problem, every act of courage or kindness or discipline, passed through your mind first. Every failure, every regret, every pattern you wish you could change, also passed through your mind first. The mind is not merely where your life happens. It is what your life is made of. The quality of your attention is the quality of your experience. The quality of your thoughts is the quality of your judgments. The quality of your emotional regulation is the quality of your relationships. The quality of your habits is the quality of your future. And yet, most people go to extraordinary lengths to optimize everything except the instrument through which everything is experienced. They research the best mattress, the most efficient workout, the highest returning investment, the most productive software, and they never spend a single focused hour understanding the mind that is doing all of this researching, deciding, planning, working, and experiencing. They let the most powerful instrument they possess operate on default settings, settings written partly by evolution, and partly by childhood, and partly by technology companies whose interests are not aligned with their flourishing. What you have been invited to consider throughout this conversation is the possibility of a different relationship with your own inner life. Not a perfect one, not a relationship in which you become some superhuman avatar of discipline and equanimity, immune to distraction and emotion and the ordinary human messiness of a real life, but a conscious one, a relationship in which you are the one deciding what you attend to, what narratives you strengthen, what habits you feed, and what patterns you allow to continue operating beneath the surface. A relationship in which autopilot is something you notice and can choose to disengage rather than something you are simply subject to. This is what it means to take control of your mind, not the elimination of what is difficult, not the transcendence of your humanity, not the achievement of a state of permanent clarity in which the mind never wanders, and the emotions never surge, and the impulses never call. Those states do not exist, and chasing them is a way of missing the point entirely. What exists, what is actually available to you right now, with the mind you have and the life you are living, is a greater degree of conscious participation in your own inner experience, a greater capacity to see the patterns before they have fully played out, a greater ability to pause, to choose, to return. Every habit you have began with a single instance of that behavior. Every thought pattern you carry was once a thought that was thought for the first time. Every automatic reaction you know yourself to have was once a response that required a decision. The neural pathways were built by repetition, which means they can be rebuilt by repetition. The mind that exists today is not the mind that has to exist tomorrow. It is the mind that exists today because of what has been practiced until now, and what you practice from this point forward. What you repeatedly attend to, what you deliberately choose, what you consciously reinforce, will build the mind of tomorrow. You cannot control every thought that enters your mind. That is not the goal. The thoughts will come, the worries, the doubts, the memories, the impulses, the old stories, and they will come without your permission, arising from depths you cannot fully see, but you can choose which ones you strengthen, which ones you return to, rehearse, feed with your energy and attention, which stories you decide, upon examination, are worth keeping, which habits you allow to become more automatic, and which patterns you introduce the friction of awareness into, slowing them down just long enough to evaluate them. Because here is the truth that has been at the center of this entire conversation. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. It may be very small, sometimes vanishingly small, but it exists, and in that space lives something that no external force can reach, no algorithm can capture, no habit can eliminate: the capacity to choose, the capacity to observe, to evaluate, to decide, the capacity to ask not what do I automatically do here, but what do I actually want to do here? Who do I want to be in this moment? What kind of life am I building? One small choice at a time. Every day, you are building something with your mind. Every thought you rehearse, every emotion you amplify, every habit you repeat, every moment of attention you give is a brick in the structure that is becoming your life. Most people never see this. They experience their lives as something that happens to them, shaped by circumstances and luck and other people's choices, without ever fully recognizing the degree to which the shape of their life is being determined by the shape of their mind. You have seen it now. You cannot unsee it. The question that remains is the only question that has ever mattered. Not what you now know about the mind, but what you will do with what you know. Not what insights have been offered here, but what practices you will build from them. Not what understanding has been reached in this conversation, but what understanding you will take into the traffic jam, the difficult meeting, the evening when the old habits call, and the new patterns feel fragile, and the distance between the person you are and the person you intend to become feels, for a moment, very wide. That distance is not a verdict. It is an invitation. Begin where you are, with the mind you have, in the life you are actually living. Notice one automatic pattern. Interrupt it once, today, with the gentlest possible awareness. Return your attention to where you choose to put it, once, when it has wandered. Pause before one reaction. Ask one honest question about one thought that has felt like a fact but might be a story. These are not impressive acts. They will not make headlines. No one will congratulate you. But they are the actual work. They are what it looks like, from the inside, to take control of your mind. And the moment you take control of your mind, even partially, even imperfectly, even for a single breath in a single moment, something shifts. Something that is hard to name but easy to feel. A quiet claiming of the inner territory, a small but genuine sovereignty. A recognition that the most important landscape in your life has always been interior, and that it has always been yours, and that it has been waiting, patiently, for you to come home. Your mind is not your enemy. It is not your fate. It is not the fixed, inevitable, unchangeable sum of everything that has happened to you. It is a living, plastic, endlessly adaptable instrument, the most sophisticated object in the known universe, and it is yours to work with. Begin.